and welcome to another episode of Unlock the Door Radio. Tonight, we have a really special guest, an author. He's a journalist, and he has written a interesting book called The Transhumanist Wager, Zoltan Istvan.
Thank you for having me on your show. I appreciate it.
Well, we're going to deal with a lot of really controversial things tonight. We're going to deal with how the whole concept of humanity will change in the very, very near future. And also such things as, well, issues relating to how far we should take the whole concept of altering what it is to be human, as in at the genetic level, and also the idea that we're going to start enhancing ourselves. But anyway, I'm just going to turn everything over to Zoltan. And before I get into this whole concept of transhumanism, I noticed in your bio, not just the National Geographic part and all these other wonderful things, but something about volcano surfing. What the heck is that?
Sure. Well, in my 20s, I was on assignment for National Geographic for the channel. And I went to a place called Vanuatu, and I was filming a lot of the tribes in the area. But there's a rather famous volcano on the island of Tanna. And, the way the trade winds blow, there's a bunch of pumice that comes out of the volcano, makes one side of the volcano just like a double diamond black slope that you would just, literally ski down. And I had known about this before, so I brought a snowboard with me. And one of my little segments from the National Geographic Channel was just specifically on volcano boarding. And basically, I just went down it. But what makes the sport so interesting is that behind you, there is kind of lava bombs and flying around the air. So it's actually a very dangerous sport. You turn your back on the volcano, and then you have all this stuff flying all around you, and you just sort of have to make it down the hill alive. And anyways, the extreme sport has since sort of caught on, and there are now a couple of volcanoes around the world that volcano boarding has, or volcano surfing, depending on what you want to call it, has caught on. And that's kind of that story. But a lot of people find it pretty fascinating. If any of your viewers want to see my little segment, just type in my name, Zoltan Istvan, / National Geographic / volcano boarding.
Wow, sounds like a very interesting. It almost sounds like Dante's Peak. You're surfing down the mountain and you're having to deal with things that could endanger your life. Hey, speaking of life, okay, it sounds, someone out there is hearing about volcano surfing. And they're probably thinking that, wow, this guy, has a death wish or something. But it seems that looking at the description of your book, The Transhumanist Wager, it seems actually that this is actually opposite. That maybe the idea of longevity is more, part of your personality. I think all authors put a little bit of their personality into their characters. Could you explain this whole, a little bit about the book? And then we can get into the issues where it's not just the fiction, but actually how, in reality, this is all going to take place in our society.
Sure. And I'll just start by answering your first little question, which was, volcano boarding doesn't really go well with the actual vision of the book, which is to try to preserve life. But I did the volcano boarding when I was quite young, and would I do it now with a family and babies? That's a whole different story. But it was exciting at the time. But the novel is really about one man, Jethro Knights, and his quest to try to overcome human mortality. And to literally conquer death and live indefinitely. And he wants to use science and technology to do that. He's basically an atheist. And the way the world is set up right now is that, much of the population is quite religious, and a lot of the main religious texts don't really aren't going to be very accommodating to ideas of living forever or people becoming so technologically advanced that they're almost like gods. And so that's the actual crux kind of the book, is there's a an unfolding drama between Jethro and the transhumanists who want to live forever and use technology to make themselves as powerful as possible, versus the religious sentiment that the world has, saying that, whoa, that's going too far. That's, let's just remain human, and we'll find peace or live forever in the afterlife. Of course, most transhumanists are atheists and don't believe in an afterlife. So that's what happens in the book. And essentially the story unfolds. It's an epic. It goes through the majority of Jethro Knight's life as he tries to get the transhumanists on board to develop the science and technology to live indefinitely. And, through that, a lot of different things happen, including a world war and, including some tragedies in Jethro's life. And so it's pretty exciting from just a fictional point of view, but it's also a book that's laden with a huge amount of philosophy. I'd say a solid 10-15% of the book is very thought-provoking, very deep thoughts. Might have to stop a few times, even on one page, and just think what is the philosophy and what is some of the meanings coming through.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. The whole thing with religion and transhumanism, I think it'd been intriguing if the recent Russell Crowe movie, the Noah movie, would have, instead of depicting like people living in like something that looks like, at least I haven't seen the movie, just looking at the costume, something like Xena Warrior Princess or something like that, and had technology has been advanced and therefore explaining why people lived hundreds and hundreds of years. Because in most of your religious texts, if you look back, there's this idea of people living these incredible lifespans. And it seems that is going to, instead of it being like an atheist would believe, a fictional narrative, it seems that this is actually possible to achieve today.
Yeah, no, and, today it definitely is possible to achieve. I would say we're 10 to 20 years away from, the average lifespan is something like in the, 70s, 80s. But I think at least in, modern countries, the average lifespan is going to easily jump to 100 within 10, 15 years. In fact, if you can survive an extra 10 years now, you're going to get another 10 years, and then the same thing's going to happen again and again until exponentially. And most of us that are living today, if you're under 50, you're going to live to 150 unless some like real tragedy strikes. Because science and technology is just growing so rapidly, so exponentially. So, and of course, if you can live to 150, then who knows what's going to happen to the world, because at that point, there'll be things like probably uploading your mind into computers and just replacing, as you had mentioned earlier in the show, replacing all your body parts with synthetic ones. I'm definitely planning on replacing an arm or a limb and a leg and certainly my heart with artificial things as they become good enough to do so. And we are only about 10 or 15 years from a lot of those things happening, specifically artificial hearts. We're probably only 5 to 7 to 8 years from the hearts, the artificial hearts being better than the human ones we were born with. And so then, like you said, with cosmetic surgery, it's going to really become a kind of a question of whether we upgrade ourselves, whether that's ethical to do so, and whether, society sort of will allow that kind of technology to, filter through the entire, through our entire species. I think a lot of people end up upgrading themselves.
Well, it's interesting. I'm an instructor and I in real life, and most of my students are like 18, 19, some 20 years old. And about 10 years ago when I started, kind of dealing with transhumanism, when dealing with ethics, I would ask how many people would do some sort of upgrade, if it was available, and, specifically how many would replace their body. If there was technology that you could just take the brain and the spinal cord and put them into a synthetic body. And 10 years ago, you hardly had anyone who would say, oh, that sounds cool or something. But now it seems that it's growing. The number of students, when I ask that question, increases. And then when I ask questions about, like, with, for instance, predictions that these computer screens that we have in front of us today will be so obsolete in 20 years. People will be able to go online directly. You know, how many people would, for instance, put a brain implant in that would allow you to connect to the internet just anytime, anywhere without any kind of external device besides that? And it's growing. The number of people saying, oh yeah, sure. In fact, it's a minority now in my classes that say, no, I want to remain just like I am. And do you see that this is, something that's going to become, not only commonplace, but also that there's a growing acceptance and more people are learning about transhumanism?
Oh, absolutely. And I have, I've been lucky to kind of come to publish my book, about a year and some time ago now, and also have some of the leading national or international blogs about that are transhumanist themed. I write for the Huffington Post and Psychology Today, and my Psychology Today blog is titled The Transhumanist Philosopher. I'm very lucky that I'm able to just speak out to the world and say some of these things. And as a result, and a result of so many other journalists writing about it and talking about it, so even just such as yourself, I am seeing the numbers of transhumanists literally explode. There's been a lot of people that believe that the population of transhumanists has tripled literally in the last 12 months. And, if you go by just sheerly the numbers on Facebook groups, and there's about 100 transhumanist Facebook groups, you can see those numbers literally. They started off 3 years ago with 200-300, and now many of them, well, a few of them at least have over 5,000. Some of them have over 10,000. And like I said, there's 100 of them. So there's a huge population boom of transhumanism going on. And it's not just that. It's all the young kids. They grew up with feeling comfortable with technology. My father or my mother are still very uncomfortable with sitting in front of a computer. They just don't really get the mouse, or the Internet Explorer. What do I use? And of course, I'm in the middle, and I started using email for the first time when I was, I think, just out of high school. But the kids that grew up now, like my daughter, I have a 3-year-old daughter, and she was able to navigate YouTube to watch, Teletubbies and Mickey Mouse videos right around age 1. And just to know, like, oh, I press that and that plays play, or she could recognize the things on the screen. So when you're talking about children at the age of 1 and 2 becoming good at using the iPad, good at using this type of technology, for them to say, oh, yeah, I would upgrade myself, or I would put a chip implant so I could connect that much quicker, it's going to be totally natural for them. And, that's one of the reasons my book is very pro-science, and I really wrote it for college students and for those young professionals just entering their careers, because I wanted to give them an inspiring message so that they would go into science and technology and hopefully get people like me, a little bit older than them and probably yourself, and give us the technology and the wonders that we're going to need to live longer, better, and more healthy lives, and especially with some of the technological wonders that are certainly going to happen here in the next 20 years. I'm very excited about the upcoming generation of transhumanists. Oh
yeah, I mean, it just seems that things are, as each level of technology increases, it just it sends everything exponentially to where, well, I mean, if you look at stuff like Ray Kurzweil, he makes his predictions not based on what exists today, but what looks like it's going to come in. I mean, what's probable. And then when that exists, what you can go from there, which, if someone hears, if you, what is that, documentary he did? The Transcendent Man. Some of it sounds really crazy, except for the fact that came out a few years ago, and already some of the stuff he was predicting is coming out now that they haven't. So
yeah, no, it's crazy. It really is crazy. It used to be, like you said, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, stuff would take some time. But these days, it's closer to 2, 3, 4 years. Just reading the other day in the New York Times that they're now starting to work a lot with thought. Like as we had mentioned, you could connect your thoughts through certain type of like laser waves, and control other mechanisms that way. And of course, they're now experimenting. People will start spending $10, $20 million on that stuff. And then eventually, some of the bigger companies like Google will say, wow, that's it. Let's spend $1 billion on it because that's the future. And very soon you're going to have that type of technology. There are already video game companies in Silicon Valley that are using headsets and they are playing video games just based on brainwaves. So we are already becoming cyborgs. And like I said, with the artificial heart and some of the synthetic limbs that they're working on, within a decade, you're going to see people saying, hey, I want to be able to bench press 2,000 kilos. And, with artificial limbs, they're going to be able to do that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was reading just recently that they've developed fiber, for robots. I mean, this fiber that it contracts, it's not based on hydraulics. So that our robotic technology, you won't, like these things where you see Asimov, over in Japan and stuff, you're not going to have that sort of robot in the future. You're going to have actually something that moves and looks like us. Well, it just seems like a logical extension then that if we have robots that we can make that will look like us, move like us, and so forth, that we're going to adapt to that technology ourselves.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Because what's going to happen is, as all technology kind of evolves, is people will say, well, it is better, and then they'll kind of work out their ethical things, and they'll, everyone gets a little bit shocked, even including myself, when we first think of this. I'm like, wow, do I really want a robotic arm? But the idea is it might be robotic, it might be, titanium steel for the first few years, but eventually it's going to become something that feels just like a human arm, if that's what we want. But most likely it's going to be much better feeling than what we have. And I think a lot of people forget that it's not just equaling what we are as humans. It's going way beyond. I hear this all the time where people say, well, I don't know if I really want to live inside a computer because I don't know if I'll be cold and, I won't have any feelings. But I try to explain to people, if you put yourself into a computer and the servers, the size of the connections and the computer chips is, let's say, 1,000 times what the human brain is, well, you might have 1,000 times more intensity of feelings. You might have 1,000 times more complexity of feelings. And that's something that a lot of people don't look at when they actually think about these things, is that we're not just making ourselves, to feel and to think like humans in some other environment. We're going to become much, much more complex, and hopefully in a very, in a way that allows us to feel that much more of existence.
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, whenever I hear people talk about, well, if you could increase IQ of children, then won't that make them socially inept? They're going to be like, I don't know, everyone's going to be like on Big Bang Theory or something like that. But most research shows that higher intelligence tends to contribute to better sociability, less awkwardness.
Oh, yeah, undoubtedly. Higher intelligence, better technology. In fact, I was just been working on an article right now for the Huffington Post about how technology, is actually improving the living standards of most lives around the world. Of course, it can't be all lives because there are anomalies here and there. But the bottom line is that so far, when you look at a 30-year window and you ask yourself, well, why are people living longer? Why are there less deaths when, people give birth and stuff like that? Generally, it has to do with the fact that there is just better access to technology, better access to foods, which come from technology and all these other things. And it's simply just raising the standard of living, and it will probably continue. And it doesn't matter if you're super rich or if you're super poor. Many of the poorest people in the world now have cell phones. And so it's just constantly technology is improving the lives of people. And I'm very excited to see, I think eventually we'll get to a point when hopefully there will be no poverty because everyone will, have access to some type of technology that at least makes them get a lot of the basics covered and stuff like that. I mean, that's one of the wonders about, I guess, the transhumanist movement is that it really does aim to improve the lives of everyone around the world, and I do believe it can do that.
Well, I have to concur in that respect. I just got back from Uganda, and what you said is true. I mean, with cell phones, I mean, you see people, three people on a motorcycle, getting around, and one of them's on a cell phone, and is one of the poorest countries on earth, and if you go to most of your, if you go to a hotel or something like that, it's got computer, it's got Wi-Fi, and more of the population's getting it, and they are seeing more, in their schools, more technology means they can connect, and this will increase their living standards because they'll be able to export things and not rely on people coming in from India and China to develop their resources. So I think the technology is what's going to lift places like Africa, for instance, to a level that we're at today. But while they're coming to our level, we're going to go to other levels too.
Oh, yeah, undoubtedly. And in fact, I've traveled extensively through Africa. Whenever I speak about the poorest of the poor, I mean it. I have been through many of the West African countries, and I found the same thing. It doesn't matter how far and how deep in Mali or Burkina Faso, some of the other places I've gone, most families still have at least one or two cell phones. Most of them have internet access already, and just knowledge. These kids are growing up with knowledge. They may still live in mud huts, some of them. But if they have access to the internet, they're seeing things that their parents and their forefathers had never seen before. It makes them want new things. It makes them want to work. It makes them want to move. And that's how the world slowly becomes a better place. And again, I know a lot of people are somewhat critical of this, saying, well, there's plenty of poor people out there. And it's true, there is. But, when you look at the statistics, it does show improvement, and the improvement is substantial enough to get excited about it.
Oh, absolutely. Hey, there's a whole bunch of different directions we can take, and I want to take a bunch of them, but it's hard to kind of determine where to start. So I'd like to start with something I think people can really kind of understand, and that's reproduction. I mean, that's something that, well, everyone's here because of it, and most people do have kids, if not now, then eventually. Now, I want to ask, how many years in the future do you think it'll be until reproduction looks more like what's like, I don't know, in a movie like Gattaca or something like that? Mikhail Kaku said something about in one of his predictions for 2030 that we're about 80% towards, we have 80% of what's depicted in Brave New World. So how long do you think it'll be before most people in the West apply science to their reproduction?
Well, I think first off, virtually everyone in the West is already applying massive amounts of science. I have a 6-week-old baby, and I can tell you and I have a 3.5-year-old daughter, and I can tell you the difference between between the 3.5 year span between my two daughters is already quite amazing. But one of the things that's happening is now you're able to test for, virtually everyone goes through this. You're able to test for, abnormalities and diseases and stuff like that up front just by testing the fetus and stuff like that and running all the blood tests. And so you eliminate the hassle of having children that might turn out, with, some type of mental disorder or anything. So that's one of the key things that I think has made, at least in the Western world, reproduction so much easier. Because, my wife is 43 and I'm 41, and we were able to kind of go way outside what is normal reproduction limits and end up with a healthy child just because we did a ton of tests ahead of time, and tests that actually most of our insurance is paid for, and it wasn't very costly. So it's wonderful. But when will we get into the genetic engineering? I know they're already working on it. I'm going to say in 2 to 3 years, they're going to start doing things routinely, like determining sex. They can already do that. And I think probably in 5 to 6 years, you're going to see you're going to see a shift to people using IVF as a primary method for impregnating themselves, because it's going to be safer, sounder. You'll be able to do it exactly when you want it. You'll take away huge amounts of the risk of, miscarriages and stuff like that. And also it's really convenience and timing. And so I see a world kind of going to a kind of an IVF world here in the next 6 to 10 years. And then what's really exciting is exogenesis, which is using artificial wombs. Now, they're already growing artificial wombs and stuff like that in various universities, and they're testing them on rats and other animals like that with some success. So I think in a world, and I wrote about this in one of my articles recently, I think in 15 to 25 years, you will see people start having children outside of their bodies so that women don't have to go through some of those dangerous periods when they actually give birth. Now, I know a lot of people will say, wow, that takes away from the essence of being a human being, and perhaps it does. So not everyone will want to do it. But, it makes it a lot easier for someone if they can just watch their child being grown in a test tube. You can monitor every little thing about them. It's going to be much safer for the child and certainly much safer for the mother. So these are some of the reproduction things that are right on the horizon. And again, they have testing going on in virtually every one of these fields. And eventually, it'll be all genetic engineering too. I know they're already doing that. And they are going to, further look at how they can, if there are bad genes, trying to put in new ones and stuff like that. That's all within a 10 to 15-year window as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it just seems to be, amongst some people don't realize just how far we've come, even with stuff like freezing embryos, how someone could actually, if they chose to, they could give birth to their twin, if their mother had frozen embryos, and then implanted them, and then, 20, 30 years later, a person could actually implant. I was talking to a former student, and, she may have to go into a educational program that's really going to be long, and she's kind of like, well, I don't want to take a risk that, I don't pass my genes on. She's really into genetics, and she's herself just looking into just donating eggs just to kind of have that, kind of Darwinian assurance that no matter what happens in the future, she passes on her genes. And, this is something that a lot of people are unaware of, but a lot of people now, especially with a lot of women, starting their careers, after school, they're like in their late 20s, early 30s, and then they wind up not being able to find a husband, or someone, and a lot of women now are turning to sperm donation and things like that. And, that was like science fiction just a generation ago. And now it's becoming more, it's really picking up speed amongst career women. So, if you're going to go that far where you're going in for IVF to have a baby, and you're choosing the characteristics of the father, because, in America you can choose I want this guy here that has these traits. It's just the next step to actually being able to say, well, maybe I also want this eye color and this hair color and these attributes that can be tinkered with in the lab and therefore give you the exact baby you want.
Oh, yeah. What's I think most fascinating about this is that this will happen because this is a multi-billion dollar industry where everyone's going to say, well, if I can choose, it's going to be like a car. You're going to want all these different accessories to it. Who goes looking for a brand new car and doesn't say, well, I actually wanted this type of stereo system, or I wanted this, type of heated seat. It's going to, we're going to go crazy with our children, which is one of the most important things in our lives, about what we pick for them. And what's even more fascinating, what's sci-fi right now, but won't be sci-fi in 10, 15 years, is also this idea of what you can do with stem cells or just even cloning yourself. You might be able to, at some point, regrow eggs that, just through DNA samples and stuff like that. So you wouldn't even have to have gone through the IVF. You would just have to, take some of your DNA. And that's right around the corner as well. And people are, already spending tens of millions of dollars on this type of scientific research. So, the whole idea of reproduction is just going to get, I believe, better and better and easier and easier. In fact, it's going to be so complex with so many choices. I think that will be if you think choosing a name is hard for your child, it's going to get even much more complex with choosing all these different characteristics that you're going to want.
If you take a look, I have a prediction that because of the popularity of manga and stuff like that in Japan, you're going to see a generation of kids that will be Japanese, but they'll have like blue eyes and red hair or something like that. But that's something that you can do in animals. You can change the characteristics in animals. And I think there's one lab I read about, but I'm not sure what their success rate is. They say that they can engineer your kids to have this hair color or something like that already.
Oh, there are already labs that can do a whole range of things. They can't do it with perfect accuracy every time, but it's good enough where they're already starting to make the news. And you wouldn't believe the patents that are going out on a lot of this stuff because this technology is so special. And anytime you talk about something that is, most people I think would be interested in at least considering it. It's just incredibly lucrative. So there's huge industries and huge amounts of investment being put into this right now, as everyone wants, a child that's going to have a natural inclination towards music or a natural inclination towards, being a sprinter or, these kind of just basic advantages. And there's going to be, of course, much more complex advantages too. And it's just even what's something I did 3 years ago with my first child. We did a bunch of freezing of the umbilical cord for stem cells and stuff like that. And so now we can regrow a lot of things. And who would have heard of a 3D printing, 3-4 years ago? And all of a sudden, add stem cells, add 3D printing, add some more development and more technology, and you can start doing incredible things in case you ever have a kidney failure or something like that. I'm really glad at least my children get to have some of these benefits because it just, as a father, it makes me very worried that something could go wrong. And nothing makes me feel better than to say, well, there's many technologies and a lot of medicine out there that can keep everyone happy and safe.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of kids, it seems to me that, at least what I've read is that they've identified most of the genes, and there's not that many really, that are responsible for aging. It seems to me that in the future that, not only will you be able to do interventions and get people to perhaps, reverse, kind of like what was that movie, Benjamin Buttons, where he starts out old and gets young. But also you'll be able to genetically engineer your kids that they'll develop normally, but that their aging process will be far slower once they hit maturity. I mean, I see that as being, not that far away.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are, again, now this is a field that just is getting so hot right now, even with Google just starting their company Calico and now putting literally probably hundreds of millions of dollars, or at least eventually they will. And, the idea of reversing aging or stopping aging is going to become one of the most interesting fields to watch here in the next 10 years, because really there's just not much resources going into it until the last 5 years. A lot of smaller, nonprofits. One of my favorite ones is SENS Research Group, but, they just have not had the resources, but now more and more people are getting on board. And so even, some of the nonprofits are getting more resources. Then you have Google and some of these other, companies coming out. Huge amounts of people are now getting involved in the actual, field of life extension. And I totally believe within, 10 to 15 years, they will be able to, stop aging and, at least, kind of on an experimental basis. And the idea is how easily will it be something that we could adapt to, the population, to individuals? How much will it cost? Those are other questions that are more difficult to ascertain. But the idea that they will have that technology in 15 years, yeah. In fact, I just recently wrote an article saying that if we were really as a species to dedicate $1 trillion to this field, I had said that within 10 years, I'm quite certain that we would overcome human mortality. We're going to do it within 20 to 30 years, just with the amount of resources that are going into it, with the amount of scientists. But if the species in the world really want to get serious and just said, hey, let's solve this problem, we could probably do it within 7 to 12 years. And, that would be amazing. Everyone would be able to either, I don't know if it would be pills or what it would be shots or how it would be done, but we would be able to live incredibly long periods of time. And, I think the most important thing to know about life extension is if you could just make it 20 or 30 or 40 years with the way technology is growing, then you're going to have the option of, doing something more like we discussed earlier, becoming a full cyborg where you replace all your body parts, or just merging with machine, or uploading your mind into computers, which I believe is kind of the most interesting aspect for me. Of course, life extension science is what's going to get us there, especially for older people living now. But there's so many different angles at it. It's just going to get super interesting. And every month that goes by, the journals are just filled with new discoveries.
Mm-hmm. I'm not going to, self plug here or whatever, but no, I mean, I normally, I've gotten a few books out there, Freedom from Conscience series, but those are psychological thrillers. But I did a manuscript that's very transhumanist, and I was just waiting because I was basing it on the premise. You might think it's funny, but that during Noah's time, that it was actually a scientifically advanced society that had overcome aging, and that's why people are listed as living 900 years. And so it's very philosophical. And I was just waiting to make sure this Noah movie didn't, have that too. So but it doesn't. But the thing is that I try to present a society in which what would it be like if people did have these really long lifespans, due to genetic engineering. They live 600, 700, 800 years. And, the social ramifications of not aging. The social ramifications, how that would deal with our family structure and so forth. I also get into the idea that in this society that I create, there is a licensing, because once they overcame aging as we know it, in order to prevent overpopulation, they institute a thing where, when someone reaches 16, they place a bunch of their cells into a fertility lab, and then they're sterilized. So then they're issued a license per every natural lifetime to, so they can have one kid to replace people that die in violent acts or something like that. And wouldn't you, if people are living, if you have a society where people are doubling and tripling and quadrupling the lifespan, isn't there going to have to be some sort of method by which you actually might have to create a licensing program like that?
Well, it's possible, certainly, and certainly very interesting too. The thing, though, is that if we end up living, let's say even, an extra 50 years here, it's likely that vast amounts, not vast amounts, but certain people would probably go off planet, exploring. Other people might want to live at the bottom of the ocean. So I wonder if how many resources would be used. And also, if you were going to live indefinitely, would you have kids in the first 1,000 years of your life? You might want to just enjoy it. So there's this natural inclination to maybe stop offspring. But, that said, obviously, if you have that many people, let's say people in a population that's continuing to explode and people have to are living much, much longer, certainly if there are limited resources, it would be a challenging issue on how you would be able to keep everyone in order and still keep the planet producing enough to keep everyone fed and healthy and alive. But certainly the licensing thing sounds very interesting and a bit dystopian too. I do like that angle.
Yeah, but the idea, I guess, would be that the person that would show responsibility would be able to have children, whereas someone that was, a drug addict or something like that, you wouldn't be issuing them a license until they were able to take care of that.
No, of course, and I definitely agree with that. In fact, I have licensing in my book, as in the Transhumanist Wager as well. I advocate for a policy that says every person that wants any child whatsoever should be given, gone through some type of examination, because every single day on planet Earth, 20,000 kids starve to death. If you just let your listeners think of that if they don't know that figure, but every single day, 20,000 kids starve to death. And the question then is, well, should those parents who had those kids ever actually had kids in the first place? Should they be allowed? And it's just very inhumane to allow children to starve to death. As a journalist, I've covered a lot of issues, and I can tell you starvation is one of the most difficult things to watch. And so, we get into more of this licensing issue, and of course that's very touchy because nobody likes to take away anyone's freedoms. But certainly when you're talking about crack babies or children starving to death or just kind of screwing up people's futures, it makes sense to type of regulate that to some extent so that you can protect the innocent, and you can also, keep a society operating in a way that's smoother and more beneficial for the greater good.
Mm-hmm. Hey, and speaking of the population too, I think that a lot of people they don't comprehend the idea that if you increase the lifespan, it doesn't mean that you're going to be 90 in a rest home for another 90 years, does it? It means that you may be 90 chronologically, but still look 40.
Oh, yeah, of course. And this is, I think, everyone says this to me, and I keep trying to tell people that, hey, when we talk about living to 150, it's not the 150 that you think of. It's, the 150 becomes the 80. And the 110, when you're 110 years old, that becomes the new 60. And when you're, when you're 90, that becomes the new 35. And I think what people don't get with the way they're going to, be doing reversing aging and stuff like that is that we don't plan to just, keep you alive as some really, really aged person, that we aim to keep you healthy alive, meaning at the very, peak of your performance as a human being. That's the goal, to keep you around 36, 37 years old. You're, for year after year after year. And I think that's what a lot of the life extension researchers are actually working on as well. Of course, it's because I think a broad amount of people are not that interested in being kept alive indefinitely if they're just incredibly old and they can't even move around the house. I think what a lot of people would be interested in is being kept at the same age, your peak age, for many, many decades.
Well, yeah, and it seems like, maybe, a lot of people don't catch the idea that our DNA is a blueprint. All it does is it organizes protein and amino acids around in a certain way, and therefore we're programmed to grow skin here, maintain an eye there, and that sort of thing. But a 90-year-old and a 10-year-old, a 90-year-old, their DNA is still there, just like it was when they were 10. And if you could find some way to reprogram to where you reverse everything, then you could, in theory, like with nanotechnology, you could, in theory, be able to rebuild yourself back to where you were maybe, like you said, 36 years old.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. And, that is the key is science in the body is simply just a puzzle. And it's just a bunch of molecules. And once we figure out how to put things in place the proper way, and we have the technology, specifically the nanotechnology, which holds huge amounts of promise for the human race. Once we figure out how to put that in the right order, we're going to be able to keep people exactly where they want to be. And that's going to be the trick. And again, I think the most important thing to know is that every year that you gain alive, every year that you live longer, science improves just that much better. And so if you can make it another 10 years, you're going to be great because it's going to be that much better. Now, if you can make it 20 or 30 years, the stuff we're going to see is just going to be astonishing. So every year that we're able to, stay alive and stay healthy is a year that we're going to be thankful for later when they're able to do the stuff they're going to be able to do, which is going to, take us all to a place that we want to be. Most likely, perfect health at exactly the right age that we want to be at.
Well, yeah, that brings up an interesting concept there, and that's true. I believe that completely. With nanotechnology, I have read some transhumanist articles that suggest that in the future we will become totally in control, not only of, like you said, the aging or being able to replace body parts, but that you could reprogram the nanotechnology to give you anything you want. You could actually, a person could, in theory, am I right? A person in theory could receive this kind of technology and be able to change their gender or change other characteristics about them, they would be programmed to do that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think people are going to be able to change color of their eyes, facial features, like literally as they go out to dinner, depending on what they want. Instead of putting on makeup, they're going to be able to actually, have stuff built in that will be able to do it themselves. It's really, and of course, that's very far-fetched and very sci-fi, and no one that I know of is actually working directly on those type of things. But I assume that something like that is absolutely possible, and probably within 10 or 15 years, you will be talking about that, because once you can go in there with nanotechnology and change, get stuff into the bloodstream, get stuff changing like that, the entire picture changes. You can just open up anything. You can, it's a puzzle. It's like Legos. It's going to be assembled the way that you want. It's just a matter of getting those Legos in the kind of configurations that you want.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the future human, it's not just what their parents did to make them the way they were, but they'll have the ultimate choice as to which direction they want. I mean, it sounds crazy, but a person could maybe when they're 90 decide, a man could decide, okay, now I want to be a woman for the next 90 years and program themselves and go through a change that would make them fully functional as a woman.
No, absolutely. And in fact, in my novel, I actually discuss this a bit, because I do believe at some point, we'll probably end up as a sexless society. It will weed itself out, because we won't necessarily need sex as a way to procreate. Procreation will, if we're still interested in it, will be done something that's entirely outside of ourselves. And, so these are the kind of changes we might go through. It might not be, useful in any way to be either male or female, or it might be useful to be, go from one day to the next to one. It's, I think it'll be whatever someone prefers, and whatever is kind of functional for them at that moment.
Yeah, some people are probably thinking, this sounds really crazy. I haven't even seen that in a sci-fi movie, but the thing is that the research in regards to the basics, like you said, I mean, no one's looking right now on how you could do sex changes with nanotechnology, but there's a lot of money. The European Union, I'm sure DARPA, is putting a lot of money into the technology in regards to building, being able to build things with nano. And I would encourage people to look it up. I mean, if this sounds too weird, if you're listening to this, please just Google it, find out for yourself. There's a lot of stuff going out there. But I change direction a little bit here. Speaking of that, it seems that a lot of this research that's being done on such things as robotics, regrowing or limbs, or being able to replace limbs with fully functional, $6 million man type thing, is being done by the defense industry. Do you have any insights into what the defense industry is doing right now? And, because war and defense seems to be where we get a lot of our technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And, unfortunately, that is the case, because I don't think there's probably anyone out there that really wants the military to be pushing forth the human species, in some type of militaristic way. However, the reality is that they do spend the most amount of money. They do have researchers working on all this stuff. They are, for example, just this summer starting to test out a real live Iron Man suit where soldiers fit inside and have all sorts of the benefits that you might have remembered from the movie Iron Man. So yes, they're definitely the biggest contributor, I believe, to transhumanist research, and things that we would call transhumanism, such as drones and stuff like that. And whether that's a good thing or not is a whole, big can of worms. I'm not a big fan of it, but at the same time, I realize I'm also thankful that there's some giant entity out there that's putting in so many resources into these types of technologies that eventually make themselves back to the public domain. So it's a bit of a catch-22 there. But certainly they are pushing all sorts of fields, transhumanist fields, in all sorts of directions as as they realize that technology, the future of the species is ultimately going to be, how far we take technology with ourselves.
Yeah, and I mean, it's much better instead of just someone gets their leg blown off by a landmine. It's much better to find a way to replace that leg than have the person in a VA hospital for years or something like that.
No, of course. And then, obviously the government has to pay that person for their entire lifetime, and that lifetime is getting a lot longer. So it just doesn't make any sense. It makes a lot more sense for the government to develop titanium legs that actually work better than biological legs, so that person is then out the door and back serving their country. So these are some of the, like I said, I'm not a fan, of course, of transhumanist technology being developed by the military, but I also see how important it is. And so it's not something that I can come down on too critically, because I also want the species to move forward as quickly as possible. And hopefully, the public will just make sure that things that are being developed and designed are actually really do benefit the greater good and move us forward, and not just something that just increases violence in the world.
Oh, absolutely. Hey, here's a question for you. Again, I think when you talk about philosophy, we've always, if you say a human being, everyone's always had kind of an idea of what, a human is. I mean, obviously there are genetic abnormalities that can cause someone not to have the typical 46 chromosomes and that sort of thing. But where do you see philosophy and ethics changing as we're able to do all of these things? For instance, I posed this question, I asked this gal who sometimes does co-hosting with me. I just posed the question to her, would you have if you could right now have your brain transferred into a synthetic body that you're never sick, you live you look like you do, all the time. If you want to have children that, you could have eggs frozen or ovarian tissue frozen. And, what would you think of that? And she jumped at it. She said, I would absolutely do it tomorrow if I could. And I'm just wondering the philosophy of the idea that if your wife, for instance, said she was going to do that, and then she, a few months later, she comes home from the clinic and you realize that her brain is in this body, but the rest of her is all synthetic. How would that affect you?
Well, I think the very first day would be incredibly strange. And, that would be a big dramatic shift in one's perspective on what it really means to be human, especially as, my wife and I, we got married as human beings. Would we have gotten married as transhumanist beings? So I think it's quite a different question. However, it's important to ask the questions, and it's important to try to embrace the answers if they really work for people. And they would work for me. I would also say to your question, yeah, I would do that right now. Now, luckily, the way technology is moving is we have a chance to adopt to things quite slowly. I think if we had asked everyone 10 years ago, can you imagine carrying around a cell phone that you would do conference calls on and Skype this and Skype, and here and there and look at the internet on in a little tiny screen in your pocket? I think a lot of people have said, whoa, I don't see myself doing that. Now, if you asked that 20 years ago, no one would have said yes. However, now we all do that basically in the Western world. And we had 10 years from when cell phones first kind of came out to where they are now, where they're, ubiquitous and we all use them. And I'm hoping that technology will also evolve like that. People will hear this radio show and they'll start to think about it. And maybe in 2 years, they'll read something in a magazine that says something more about it, except now it's almost here. And then in 4 or 5 years, they'll see it at the store. And maybe 2 years later, they'll actually buy it and start trying some of these things. This is how I see it happening. And I think if it happens like that, a lot of people are going to do it. The philosophy is not so, overnight you have to change. I think if it was, I think a lot of us would be caught off guard. So I spend a lot of my time just trying to tell people about these things, especially the philosophies of them, about transhumanism. My book's all about that. And I'm hoping that they'll hear it now, they'll hear it again in a few years, they'll see it on TV. They'll see, art and stuff like that, and other things that will happen to them. And eventually, when the time comes for them to accept life extension science and some of these crazy technologies we're all going to have here in 10, 15 years, they'll be ready for it, and it won't be such a big shift. It's like I said with the new generation coming up. It's just not that weird for them to think of uploading their mind because they have been working on an iPad or a computer since they've been 1 or 2 years old.
Yeah, and I mean, I still remember when they had the first, what they called test tube baby. Nowadays we wouldn't call it a test tube baby. But there was actually people speculating, well, will this kid have a soul and all these kinds of ridiculous things, just because this person was fertilized outside the human body. And now, I mean, IVF, I mean, there's plenty of people going that route. I mean, and like you said, this will probably be the future. Where, the idea of, a romantic weekend at, in a cabin somewhere and you conceive a kid will be seen as almost as irresponsible as not getting your kids vaccinated, because people are like, what? I mean, you're taking a huge risk with your kid, don't you? I mean, don't you think this will be the case that we will adopt all of these kinds of technologies and they will become the norm instead?
Oh, and I definitely think so. And a lot of people will say, a lot of the naysayers will say, no, we won't do this. That's too far-fetched. But what they fail to consider is if, for example, you try to live in the modern world without a cell phone or without a car or without access to the internet, it's almost impossible to keep up. It's impossible to compete. It's impossible to make any, to really get ahead. It's just sort of required at this point to embrace a certain amount of technology in order to get along in the modern world. And I think as time goes on, more and more technologies will come out that everyone will have to accept, because if they don't, they'll get left behind. And I think ultimately, no one wants to get left behind, so they're going to probably be more open to accepting technology. Even the religious people out there that would probably always say, no, I'll never do that. I think they're going to be open to doing it too, and they'll find ways to have their religion accommodate this technological, growth of civilization.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you take a look, you could look 60 years ago, I don't think there was any Protestant church out there that endorsed or even, had a kind of tolerant attitude towards using artificial birth control. And yet now, if you look at American Protestant churches, I think most Protestants, use birth control, whereas, that would have been unheard of, as I said, 60 years ago. And I think the same will be true of many of these technologies we're talking about now.
Yeah, no, undoubtedly. And in the Catholic Church, which is 1 billion people strong, will have to reverse its stance on these things. If it doesn't, it's going to disappear. And so what I constantly see happening is that religion will accommodate technology. It'll fight it, tooth and nail all the way down. But eventually it'll do it quietly, subtly, as it realizes that in order to survive into the 21st and the 22nd century, they have to adjust to the modern world, because otherwise the division between people becomes too great, and then you have a Brave New World scenario. And that's the scenario that no one wants to, I think, see. So I definitely believe, everyone's going to have to accept these technologies, eventually.
Where can people find your book, The Transhumanist Wager?
Sure. They can find it on Amazon.com. Just go in, type in The Transhumanist Wager, and you can buy the paperback version or the ebook Kindle version. And I also have a website, which is ZoltanIstvan.com or TranshumanistWager.com, where you can also find out more information about myself and my book. Okay, well, I encourage people that are even partially interested in what the world's going to shape up for themselves and also their family to look into that. Okay, well, Zoltan, thank you very much for being on this evening. Take care, y'all. Bye now.
The Anti-Media Radio, your host Nick Burnaby here on UCY.tv.